Italian bind-off, also known as tubular bind-off, is a method used to finish off your ribbing. It blends in with the texture of the 1x1 rib stitch, creating this beautiful elastic edge. I will guide you through the 3 basic steps of creating this gorgeous detail. The first step is to create this chunky edge, which emphasizes the details of the cast off. When I have reached the right length of my project, I continue knitting 2 more rows, but instead of repeating the regular knit and purl ribbing, I knit 1 stitch and slip the next purlwise with the yarn in front. I do this by knitting my first stitch as I usually would do. Then I enter the next stitch purlwise with my right needle, keeping the yarn in front of my work. Gently, I slip the stitch onto my right needle, and now the yarn strand lies in front of the purled stitch. This makes the fabric more dense. And now, I just continue doing this until I reach my last stitch. If your project is knitted flat, just turn the work and continue knitting as before. Knit and slip. But in my case, this project is a pair of fingerless gloves knitted in the round, so I slip my first stitch and purl the next. I do this by entering the first stitch purlwise with my right needle, keeping the yarn on the back side of my work. And now the yarn strand lies behind my stitch. I purl the next stitch and continue doing this until I finish the round. And now it is time for step 2, prepping the stitches. To make it easier to explain, I will show you the rest of the process on this knitting sample. First, I make sure that my yarn tail is approximately 3 to 4 times the length of my project. I thread my needle, and I am ready to prep my 2 first stitches. But before we start, here is the most important things to remember about Italian bind-off. Only pay attention to the 3 first stitches on your needle. The others don't matter right now. Keep in mind, if you enter a stitch knitwise or purlwise, knitwise is when you enter a stitch from the left side as if you were knitting it, and purlwise is entering a stitch from the right side as if you were purling it. And last but not least, notice if I say as it is or opposite during this tutorial. If I say that I enter a stitch as it is, I mean that I enter a knit stitch knitwise and a purl stitch purlwise. On the other hand, if I say that I enter a stitch opposite, I mean that I enter a knit stitch purlwise and a purl stitch knitwise. So now it is time to prep and secure my 2 first stitches so they won't unravel. One by one, I enter the 2 stitches opposite of what they are. My first stitch is a knit stitch, so I bring my needle through the first stitch purlwise, and I gently pull the yarn through. My second stitch is a purl stitch, which means I have to enter this one knitwise. It is a bit more difficult, so here is another rule of thumb. Always go behind a knit stitch and in front of a purl stitch. So to reach the purl stitch, I bring the yarn behind the knit stitch. I bring my needle in between my first and second stitch. Then, very carefully, I flip my needle and gently enter my purl stitch knitwise. I gently pull my yarn, and now the 2 stitches are secured, and I'm ready for step 3, binding off stitches. So now it is time to focus on the 3 first stitches on my needle. No matter if your first stitch is a knit or a purl, just remember this. Enter the first stitch as it is, and slip it off the needle. Then skip the second stitch and enter the third stitch opposite of what it is. My first stitch is a knit stitch, so I enter it as it is, knitwise, and I slip it off my needle. To follow the rule of thumb, I skip the second stitch with the yarn in front, because it is a purl stitch, and I enter the third stitch opposite of what it is, purlwise. I gently pull my yarn, and the first stitch is secured. And now, the first stitch on my needle is a purl stitch, so I enter it as it is, purlwise, and I slip it off my needle. Again, to follow the rule of thumb, I skip the second stitch with the yarn behind, because it is a knit stitch. I bring my needle in between my second and third stitch, and then I flip my needle and enter the third stitch opposite of what it is, knitwise. I gently pull my yarn, and 2 of my stitches are now secured. While I continue binding off my stitches, I simply count to myself, 1, 2, 3. And as I make the bind off, I slowly begin to see the beautiful edge appear. When I reach the 2 last stitches, I simply enter them one by one as they are. And now the Italian bind-off is done. I hope this tutorial was helpful to you, and if you want to try out the Italian cast-on as well, you can find a step-by-step guide right here. Thank you so much for watching.